Actually, that was a very good topic. I mean, what I take from all this is, Karen, anti-competitive behaviour is bad, and it's very easy. It happens very easily in developing countries for all sorts of reasons. Phil, a competition policy is a good way to stop that, and there may even be some goods that come out of a competition policy. And then finally, keep it simple, because actually you can make this far too complicated and difficult. I try to think, Mother Teresa, just been appointed president of a country and really wants development to happen with a lot of business development as part of that, struggling with climate change and so on. What Karen says is industrial policy of some kind is going to be necessary. What Phil says is that might involve competition, and I guess Michael agrees. Protection, Michael agrees. So it's not entirely straightforward, I don't think. Let's have some thoughts and contributions on that. Our normal rules are, please, you stand up, you say who you are, and you don't have to ask a question. You can say something. We'll start there. The chap in the brown jacket.
It's not my phone, honest. I'm Jerry Marshall from Transformational Business Network. Phil touched on the small and medium, small business sector, saying that maybe that was the thriving part of the economy. And I know some of the things that Michael would want to do and advise Mother Teresa would help small companies. But I think we've missed on some of the barriers to entry, particularly for small and medium companies. And I think this is a potentially vibrant part of the development economy, and so part that's seriously underrepresented in developing countries compared with the West. My experiences, my personal experience is that the barriers include things like the startup costs thousands of pounds and months of time to set up a company, very expensive broadband because it's a state monopoly, opaque and random tax schemes, including you will voluntarily contribute $1,000 to the refurbishment of the local police headquarters. Then there's directors of aid-funded, aid-supported investment funds who prevent any investment in anything that competes within their companies. There's a cost of importing capital equipment, and there's a very high interest rates. All those things are serious barriers to starting companies in developing countries. And I guess the question is, what can we do? What can DFID do? What can business do, private sector do, to encourage and pressurize governments to make changes to be more small business friendly? I have personally challenged Tony Blair and Prime Minister Fayyad since I've been particularly working in Palestine, and it has made not a jot of difference. So any ideas would be valued.
I asked them to sort out peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. That didn't work either. The chap behind you, please.
Thanks. My name's Richard Grant. I work for a consulting firm called In Development. A couple of thoughts really in relation to how one integrates the insights that the panel have presented into development assistance policy. And I suppose they're questions really. No one on the panel mentioned the demand side really for greater competition, and I personally feel that support to civil society in terms of consumer representation can be a powerful incentive for better regulation from within the country. And looking at it from the outside, and very much from a donor perspective, to what extent, if at all, given the huge range of other issues which are also important, should competition policy form part of development conditionality? I think that's something of an open question for me in relation to very many other challenges and issues that countries might have. So I don't know the answers to those, but maybe.
Do you have a view on the sort of the Mother Teresa question? I mean,
I wouldn't trust her. It's all no.
Are there things that government should be using competition policy for in order to be champions of business development?
Well, I feel that I feel that, as Phil said, I think that governments often do try and incentivise or develop a system which enables a local champion or a regional champion to emerge. and I think that probably is a legitimate aspiration, but in my experience in the Horn, East and Central Africa, very often that good intention and the good intention that Mother Teresa might have is undermined by a lot of other vested interests, even of those you're trying to support and protect sometimes.
We'll come back to the panel on that in a second, but we'll take 2 or 3 others. Let's just stay on this side. We'll take 2 there and then come back down here. So the guy in the glasses, please.
Hello, my name's Neil McCulloch from the Institute of Development Studies in Sussex. First of all, thank you very much for 3 excellent presentations, very thought-provoking. The question I wanted to raise was related to some research that we've been doing. We also have a DFID-funded research program called Public Action for Private Investment. And one of the premises of that program has been, if you look around the world, it is not entirely obvious that places with wonderful investment climates are always the ones that have done the best, and ones with lousy investment climates are always the ones that have done the worst. In fact, one can point to several examples of countries with really pretty bad investment climates which have performed rather well, and vice versa, ones that have really endeavored to make substantial reforms and really haven't seen the results from that. I'm not arguing for one moment that we should necessarily have sort of non-transparent and close relationship-based regulatory policy, and it should be very partial and so forth. But the reality of the matter is that in most countries we see precisely that. We see that it is very partial. We see that it is extremely opaque, as you mentioned, and we see that it is also extremely relationship-based. And so it strikes me that we have a little bit of a problem in our analysis, because a premise of our analysis is that, in fact, you want to introduce good regulatory policy, you want to introduce transparency, you want to introduce all these things which we all believe to be good, and yet there are many countries that have done rather well by not necessarily introducing these things. As Michael pointed out, some people seem to get on very happily without it, as you were referring to competition policy. And it strikes me that one of the potential reasons for that is because we haven't spent enough time thinking through precisely why these relationships are opaque. What exactly are the politics? The name of the session included the word politics, and I think we need to think a little bit more about why those precise interests happen in practice, and in particular why the relationship-based investments that you get between large investors which are very opaque, who have a very close relationship to the governments, but nonetheless deliver growth, may sometimes be successful because of the security that provide to the investments that are made. Thank you.
That's a kind of developmental state argument, really, isn't it, around commitment to development. We'll take the chap at the back, and then we'll have a pause for the panel, and then we'll come down the other side.
Oh, Christ. Sorry, Ian Anderson, Gatsby Foundation. It's quite interesting because the comments from the panel seem to split in. Into 2 halves. There's the competition side around. That's a negative government function, preventing businesses from doing something wrong. And then there was, to an extent, in Karen's presentation, a positive. How can we actively promote competitive markets through infant industries, SEZs, and so on? What we're trying to do, supporting sectors in Africa, it might be great to hear maybe a bit more on how that can practically be done. How can you practically encourage governments, kind of back to about politics, how can you practically encourage governments to promote sectors within a country, and what are the tools of industrial policy beyond just competition?
And anything you've learned at Gatsby that you want to share?
One thing we've learned in dealing with the cotton sector on competition policy is actually a bit counterintuitive. In order to promote investment in cotton farmers, cotton ginners will only do that if they have quite protected, regulated blocks of land whereby the cotton farmers are entered into a contractual relationship with those ginners, and the ginners then have an incentive to invest in credit, training, fertilizer, whatever, with those farmers, on the understanding those farmers will then sell at the end of the season to those specific ginners. If you have a more open, free, competitive market, you end up with a free-for-all amongst the cotton farmers at the end of the season. Nobody who's invested sees a return on their investment. Next season, nobody invests, yields collapse, and
Very good. That was actually a fascinating set of interventions. Thank you. We'll take 2-3 minutes each, or not more than that, because I want to bring in the other side of the room. Karen?
Yeah, is this working? Okay, thanks very much. Yeah, very interesting comments and questions there. I think on the first issue, should competition policy form part of development conditionality? Well, first of all, I'm not sure conditionality is a very good way of approaching it, because anything that's conditional is not bought into by the government itself. But even ignoring that particular perspective, I think the point is that it's not just about narrow competition law. It's about the fact that governments already know, I think, to a large degree, what needs to be done to stimulate growth. The economics answers are there already. Most of the time we know what needs to be done. The problem is implementing it and getting government to do it, because of all these vested interests that we were talking about. There's very strong interests out there opposed to the kinds of reforms that are needed to benefit the economy as a whole. And it's that problem of overcoming vested interests which I think is absolutely critical to this, and it's that which is holding up growth in many countries. And so what my final slide was alluding to, but I didn't have time really to go into it in more depth, is how mobilising these groups, these interest groups in favour of pro-competition reforms is one key way of overcoming the vested interests opposed to competition reforms, who speak with a very loud voice, as Phil was saying. The potential new entrants are never at the negotiating table because they're only potential new entrants. They're not in the country yet. So there's a real imbalance in terms of the loudness of voice of the different sides of the argument. So I think we need to be cleverer about how mobilising those kinds of interests in influencing policy. But it's not very easy to do for the reasons I've said, because the companies are often not in the country, so they can't really be engaged in that process. But I think there is a hugely important role for consumer groups, and that's where competition authorities can play a role as well, even though they're ineffective and sometimes abuse their mandate. They can play a really important role in terms of building the evidence base and mobilising support for and talking about in the media these kinds of issues, and beginning to get awareness up and encouraging consumer groups to tackle some of these issues and start to advocate for change, which is the only way you're going to get governments to start to respond. But it's not easy, because these vested interests are so strong, it's difficult to overcome them.
No, so slightly, if I may just interrupt, so in terms of you beg the question, that there's a dilemma, isn't there? I mean, what happens if chicken or egg? I mean, what happens if you haven't got a strongly mobilised pro-competition interest group, but you've got a competition law, or you haven't got a law yet, but you're about to introduce something? I mean, you run a lot of risks. So do you not do anything until you've got all these people?
I think the problem is that in practice, you won't manage to do it until you've got these people lined up. So I think you need to be able to influence government. The problem is the competition authorities, even if they're trying to do the right thing, they have to have the support of government or they get overridden. And so the role of government is really important. And if to the extent that they respond to electoral interests and interest groups who are lobbying them, then that is the only way really to give the support to policy that is needed. And it's not just about competition authorities, it's about the policy framework for the whole economic policy of the country more broadly. So I want to get away from this idea that it's about competition law and competition authorities. It's about the overall policy framework, openness to trade, industrial policy, procurement. There's a whole range of things which affect how competitive and dynamic that country's economy is going to be. And it's these things which I think are probably the priority. But as I said, governments often know what the solution is. They just don't have the incentives to pursue the right solutions. I think that an interesting point was raised. I think there are trade-offs between some of these policies. So you can provide protection or offer protection to new entrants in order to encourage them into the market, and that can work because it gives them greater profits. But the problem is that you don't want just that one monopoly to have protection forever. So you have to have some kind of time-limited arrangement there. And so that can help to overcome some of these investment climate problems and barriers to entry. So there's a trade-off there. It's an uncompetitive solution, but in some ways it may have positive development outcomes. But you do need strong institutional arrangements around things like that in order to ensure that over time there is liberalisation gradually, and that those vested interests are not strong enough to prevent that liberalisation from ever happening, which is what has happened in practice in a number of cases.
Karen, can I
Jump.
pause?
Yeah.
Let Phil take the microphone. And Mother Teresa.
I was hoping Michael was going to get there. I'm trying to think where to start. Should you tie competition policy to assistance? Yes and no. In some circumstances, it's actually very useful for nascent civil society organisations to have someone external putting pressure on the government to do what they think is interesting. So sometimes it works extremely well when you have in a sense, an internal demand that is underrepresented in the political system. It can actually work extremely well. In a large number of circumstances, it works extremely badly, where you have a tradition of the World Bank wandering in and saying you need an all-singing, all-dancing competition law, and you get, as a number of countries, I've seen the brochures, beautiful brochures with wonderful laws that are all-encompassing. I mean, they include absolutely everything, but they just aren't enforced in any way, partly because the poor people that get put into the job have absolutely no political power, or they have no budget, or they don't have an office, or they end up, as we found, I think, with Pakistan recently, you move against the cement cartel, you get fired. Thankfully, the guy then got his job back the next day because the political furore was so great that the government was forced to back down from a fairly naked attempt to stop the competition regulator doing a good job. And he's a good lad, actually. I mean, the Pakistan authority is a very good one in a bloody difficult country to operate competition policy. The development side of things, I mean, everyone picks and chooses their pet theory about why people develop. I heard a brilliant one this morning that on the anniversary of Lehman Brothers collapsing, which caused a recession, and the radio host in Bristol said, no, he said, you've got to realise a year ago today, it was the last episode of Grange Hill. That's what caused the recession. I think we have to be very careful as to identifying how development worked and how development didn't work. And I always wonder about the geopolitics of this. I mean, when you think about the countries that have developed since World War II, Korea, Japan, and you think about the Cold War, and you think about the access that the Americans gave to those places and allowed them to get away with a lot more than it would ever allow now. I think the world of the 1950s through to the 1980s was geopolitically a very, very different world. I simply don't think that any country that tries to do what Korea was allowed to do and Japan were allowed to do and encouraged to do would actually have the support of anyone at the moment, because no countries, in a sense, matter in the sense that they used to matter to any of what's left of the superpowers, if there are any superpowers left. So I think, in a sense, that argument's almost historically interesting, but I'm not sure that countries can be given the room to do it anymore, because an awful lot of countries, the big powerful countries, don't care about anyone anymore for their own reasons.
Use competition policy in any way for the kind of positive orientation you were talking about?
Domestically or in pushing? Oh, domestically, yeah. No, I mean, competition policy is a very good thing in countries that can handle it. I mean, I would disagree a bit with Michael. I mean, I'm a great believer in merger policy. I love merger policy because for developing countries. I know it's sad, but I love merger policy because it's a free education. If you force companies to file merger filings with you, you get to find out about how a sector works quicker than any university course will ever give you. And if you're a new authority and you say, well, actually, Coca-Cola and Schweppes, you've got to file some documents with me so I can have a look and see whether there's an effect here. And in certain African countries, that created an absolute monopoly. And a fine African regulator actually did write to Coca-Cola and said, you need to send me all your documents. And they totally ignored him, and then he sent him a letter and said, you do realise that ignoring me can put you in jail for 3 months. Do you really want to spend time in an African jail for 3 months? The guys came and saw him the next day. But that taught him an awful lot about that sector. He got lots of free information that allowed him to understand how that sector works. And if you're an economic regulator, getting a free education in how the sectors of your economy work is great. So I'm a great believer in merger policy as an education tool. You can set the levels wherever you want, but as an education tool, it's brilliant. I agree with procurement. Procurement, I think, is the starting point. I think for every developing countries. I mean, but it's not a one-size-fits-all situation. Bhutan had a really cool way of dealing with vertical restraints, where they had a monopolist that had control of all imports, and they basically banned vertical restraints of any description. They said you cannot sign any vertical agreement at all, which meant that anyone could import goods from India. And it meant that there was greater competition, lots more people got access to goods, and there wasn't the rent controlled and the corruption and everything that ties into that. So they simply made it illegal. And so you know, different countries have different ways of dealing with their competition problems. But so long as they understand that, you know, you don't just take the Sherman Act from the Americans, or you don't just take the Articles 81 and 82 and Articles up to whatever else from the Commission and just dump them into your law. If you can do it intelligently and you can do it with a bit of support from civil society, and, you know, been there, done that with civil society, please. You know, it's bloody difficult trying to get civil society engaged in these issues.
Okay, just give me one example, kind of very quickly, of one thing the British government has done using competition policy to promote champions.
To promote champions? Lloyd's HBOS. I mean, it clearly wrote a law to exclude that deal from competition law. I mean,
Okay. Not a trivial
Phew,
example.
that was a quiz one.
Speaking as a Lloyds Bank customer, thank you very much.
or not, yeah.
Michael.
Yeah, I mean, the whole question of using industrial, the sort of connection between competition policy going into industrial policy and then national champions wasting large sums of money is a sort of you know, you can come up with loads of examples. The one I always like is the Airbus Boeing cartel. Sorry, did I say that? I mean, it seems to me it's amazing that we've ended up in a situation where we have a sort of, we really do have a sort of a nuclear arms race between Europe and the US, where each taxpayer is required to compete every year to pour more and more money into Airbus and Boeing, which has only really had the effect of eliminating McDonnell Douglas as the third entrant, third player, and subsidises everyone else's air travel at the expense of European and US taxpayers. But I'm not sure it does actually anything else. And that's all done in the name of a competition policy within state aid. I mean, that's a sort of rather absurd example, maybe, but it's where you can end up, and it's an illustration of the problem with the problem with industrial policy once it creeps over international champions is it often seems a good idea to start with, and it can be a good idea when you time limit. You say we need to do this here, we need to develop this here. What of course immediately happens is, firstly, you create a political constituency that has to be fed, and trying to take away the support for that national champion might be easy, but more often than not is not. And you end up just pouring taxpayers' money down the away.
How do you react to the Gatsby cotton example?
Well, that's an interesting, because I've come up with a few of those. That comes up quite often, or various versions of that. And I think the short answer to that is that, to be blunt, that's when people say that there's a misunderstanding about competition policy. And quite often I've seen people try to say, but competition law would stop us from setting up the proper arrangements. Well, we're getting into sort of theological areas of competition law, which is why I don't want competition law to go more than beyond the very limited areas. In the EU, we have an in EU law we have an understanding as to what is a restraint of competition, which would very clearly, I would suggest, regard the long-term arrangements between the ginners and the farmers as not even being a restriction of competition. Yeah, they're just not. It's just not part of the competition law. But the problem is, again, when you tell people here's Article 81, apply that, people suddenly say, well, these long-term arrangements must be restrictions on competition. We must knock them down. Now, I don't think a proper understanding of competition law even puts them anywhere near the prohibition. Is my own view. I don't know the details of that example, but and it's a classic example of where competition policy, as I've seen it many times, is sort of misused by people who, at the most absurd, would almost suggest that any long-term contract is a restriction of competition. Well, at its most banal, that's true. Any long, my 3-year contract with British Gas to supply it on a dual fuel basis is a restriction of competition, because I've agreed that for 3 years I won't go and talk to EDF. But that's not what competition law is about. That just misses the point entirely. And the reason why I have a 3-year deal with British Gas is because that British Gas is giving me supposedly a better deal on, et cetera, and they can, if you trust Ofgem, of course, to have done the right thing. I mean, there's another example. You were asking about examples where British government has at least tried to use competition policy to promote a public good. I mean, utilities would be an area, particularly in energy. Now, whether it's achieved it or not is perhaps open to debate. Whether it's done it in a clear and manner is another question. But I mean, just picking up the other question about what would you do. I mean, I'm just a lawyer, so I'm only going to talk about law. I'm not going to sort of talk about fancy policy. Just what laws, how would you use law to improve things? To take the example of the SME problem, there may be laws that can address startup costs. Taxes, again, there may be laws that can help there. Obviously, there are things you can do. But where competition law and procurement law might help, they're not going to solve the problem, but they might help, is your expensive broadband and your payment to for the police station. Because on my minimal suggestion of what you should do in competition law, I did say you should have a competition law which enables you to go after the guy who is strangling development of the internet. That seems to me that's part of your minimal requirement. The person who won't let you use the port at less than, except on absurd terms. Those are the minimal things you go for, those gatekeeper points. Corruption, well, of course, there are corruption laws, and maybe one should go first to anti-corruption laws rather than other areas. But that can be difficult in itself. If there's anything procurement achieves, and procurement policy people will grandly tell you that procurement achieves value for money, it achieves all sorts of other important public goods. And again, we can debate what that does or doesn't achieve, but what it does certainly achieve is a measure of transparency which makes corruption that little bit more difficult. Not impossible, but that little bit more difficult.
Okay, very good. We've got another 10, 12 minutes. Let's take some on this side, starting at the back. Put your hands up on this side of the room if you want to say something. Okay, I think you're first. You're as close to the back as we can get. Who's got the microphone? Thanks.
Thank you. Andrew Dakers, until recently head of public affairs at Business in the Community. I'm also a local councillor, so I find myself trying to help businesses navigate the local regulatory environment. And I'm also a director of a micro-enterprise which imports from Thailand and sells into the UK high street. Two parts to my question. The first relates to, I suppose, the existing sort of competition law framework generally in Western countries, which, to my mind, generally has very much a focus on price efficiency. And I wondered what panellists' thoughts were as the extent to which and how well competition law handles non-efficiency factors, i.e. social and environmental issues. And following on from that, and some of the comments that have sort of come up around collaboration and voluntary agreements, I'd be interested in the panellists' thoughts around concerns that I've had as a small business, but I've also heard from much larger companies within Business and the Communities membership, that when you, I suppose, are looking to put in place a voluntary agreement that might raise standards, essentially through a sort of self-regulatory or co-regulatory approach on corporate responsibility issues, that seems to be very difficult, or I suppose for some businesses risky to do. Given perhaps some of the actions of the Office of Fair Trading, and also changes in competition law that came through in 1998 with the sort of removal of the notification and authorisation process.
Should competition law impose social standards? Is that your argument?
Or to what extent should it perhaps be a greater enabler of businesses collaborating to self-regulate and co-regulate to drive a race to the top, as opposed to sometimes, I think, a race to the bottom?
Okay, thank you very much. Who else? Yes, please.
Hi, it's Ida Horner from Ethnic Supplies. Question for Karen. Nepotism is embedded in most African societies, and that goes into business and regulation. I did wonder whether you came across this as an issue in terms of running businesses effectively or affecting competition in any way. The other issue is challenge really for a lot of people trying to run businesses in some parts of Africa is one of corruption. And I suppose it's our take on it here in the West. You know, we might see it as sort of corruption, but they might see it as a way of life. For instance, that, you know, someone that sits at the customs port that isn't very well paid may decide to hold your goods and refuse to release them until they will come up with a reason. And really, the real reason behind that is the fact that they are badly paid or haven't been paid for months, and that could have explained why you had kilometre of trailers full of sugarcane, because the workers have walked away without pay. Company called Tallow Oil, which is a British company based out in Uganda, they have refused to pay any forms of bribes. The government is used to that this company won't pay, so they always get whatever they want signed in proper timing, as and when, without having to pay out a penny in bribes. And I personally think that they set a very good example for all the other companies that are faced with similar situations. That if you choose to pay, then where do you draw the line? So the answer, I suppose, is not to start paying at all. And finally, it's the issue of ethics and competition. I don't know if that came up at all. Last month we were in Sweden looking at designing telephone services for the developing regions, and we looked at a case where an Austrian-based university was trying to devise mobile telephone system that would enable seaweed farmers in Zanzibar to earn a lot more money, but none of the women, mostly women, would speak to them. And when they got to the bottom of that, the government was behind it, as well as a Japanese company. And any woman who stood out of line to speak to these people would have lost their job. So really, this research was cut at that point, because they realized, do we intervene and, contribute to these women losing their jobs? We don't live here, we have to go home. So really strong ethical dilemma there to deal with.
Good, thank you. Let's go in a different order this time. Why don't we take Michael first?
Right, that enables me to pass the difficult questions on to others with great aplomb. I'll pick up a couple of the points, but not all the points raised. I won't claim to be, an expert on corruption, whatever that means. I mean, obviously, have had to be involved in drafting and in various cases involving corruption in a number of countries. But yeah, in this country, all one can say about corruption is, the more you do it, the more embedded it becomes, and the only way out seems to be to break the cycle. The problem with the customs officer or the policeman who just charges you not to fine you is that, as you say, that's what he does. I mean, there's no way out other than someone has to say no. Law itself doesn't seem to be enough. Law seems a bit hopeless, and which is why I think all one can do is maybe try and just make it a bit more difficult. I mean, I keep banging on about public procurement law, and I'm not sure it's certainly not the answer to everything, but it certainly, in my own experience in this country particularly, and in a few other European countries, corrupt relationships have broken down quite quickly when people have been compelled to put their relationship through a more open and transparent basis on a process which is reviewable by others. It's got to help. Whether it succeeds is another thing. The other question I was going to pick up with briefly was a sort of touch on secondary policies. I mean, I would have said that on the whole, competition law and procurement law were pretty bad at dealing with secondary social and development policies. They often will talk about furthering policy. I mean, the EU in procurement, there's a lot of stuff in the legislation about promoting environmental and promoting social policies, but in fact, the consistent approach has been to narrow the applicability of those policies. If you look again at the way the WTO government procurement agreement deals with social environmental policies, again, it takes a very narrow view as to what is permissible, for the simple reason that historically it's the application of those policies that has allowed an enormous range of discretion to go into these decisions, and so it's those decisions about social and environmental type issues which have become the cover, as it were, for corrupt practices. Now, I don't know that there's any easy way out of that. In this day and age, it is something which people are grappling with, to try and ensure that you can use appropriate secondary policies in procurement decisions, but do it in an objective and transparent way. But it is a real challenge for the moment. It's a real challenge not just within the UK, within the EU, but beyond, and it's a challenge also for the way in which procurement law is accepted. There's certainly, I'm aware, of more than one country which has made it plain that they will not take up procurement law simply because of the way in which an open procurement law would affect what it regards as important policies. For example, in one country, a procurement policy, a well-embedded procurement policy that gives a preference to a particular ethnic group within that country. If that's your government, if the law requires that, there simply isn't an international procurement standard that will live with that. The difficulty, of course, is that it means that while you might want to put in place a procurement law sort of to work around what you regard as the unacceptable policy, it's very difficult for the international community, for those people coming in to help set up those laws, to say, well, we'll pretend you don't have that policy, but leaving aside that problem there, here's the law you should use anyway. I mean, these are real challenges in a number of places.
Thank you. Karen? Can you perhaps, as you're speaking, pick up this point about the kind of the social regulations governing trade?
Sure, yeah. Well, to start with, if I could just take up this point about nepotism, because we definitely did find a lot of evidence of that. In some countries, everybody in the government seems to also have very strong business interests. And so I think, a solution there is to do with transparency and rules on business interests, etc., in the way that we have in this country as well. But we have problems as well, as what we've often heard in the newspapers. But in some countries we came across, for example, where there were two companies and their market share could reliably be predicted depending on which party was in power at the time, because it just depended, because there were individuals in government that were associated with each of the companies. So I think that has a huge impact on which businesses can survive in these kinds of situations. The question of how competition law can handle social and environmental issues, I think it's an interesting one. I think there's this example that somebody told me that in the you probably know this much better than I do actually, but in the UK, businesses tried to get together to pay farmers more money for producing milk or beef or something, and but they were prevented from doing that by the competition law. So that that could have addressed one of these social issues that keeps coming up in the media. Now I think there's a question as to whether this is the best way of tackling some of these problems. I think there are other ways of tackling these problems, and I think that businesses can collaborate to promote social and environmental goals without having to fall foul of competition law. So I think it's a difficult area, and probably you have to consider it on a case-by-case basis.
Thanks so much. Phil?
Michael very kindly said you can handle that one when that issue came up, which is very nice of him. The issue about the wider public interest, if we can call it that, I mean, it's in competition policy areas and discussions, there has been a long and very fraught relationship with what you could call the public interest. We used to have a public interest test in the UK. The public interest test, the reason why we no longer have a public interest test, there are many and varied reasons, some of which I'll as a sad economist, I shall go into in a bit of detail. But one of the good reasons why we got rid of the public interest test is because it never actually had the interest of the public at heart. It was simply a rather useful fig leaf to cover an otherwise anti-competitive agreement that was screwing the public. And if you look at some of the old decisions that covered with a public interest test, they were very much, well, yes, we know this is terribly bad for consumers, but we found a sort of another excuse to allow this to carry on because the politicians want it to happen. The problem with the public interest test is that it's vague. It tends to be open to misuse, and is misused and has been misused, and in a large number of places is misused badly. Now, I think one of the more interesting reasons why we've got rid of it, which is I think a more technical response, is why I think it's coming back as an issue now, is I think the last sort of 10 years in competition policy discussions, we've had what can be loosely termed a golden age, where the discussions around consumer welfare, which is the test that we now have in most Western jurisdictions, it's been easy to move to that standard because the total factor productivity argument, which is the overall economy, and the consumer welfare argument have essentially overlapped. What has been good for the consumer has been good for industry because we've had factor mobility, we've had easy access to capital, we've had relatively low unemployment, we've not had what you call the negative externalities of deals happen. Now, I think what's been interesting in the last year, there's been many interesting things in the last year, is that we've had a disjuncture where the consumer welfare interest and the total factor interest are actually now no longer aligned because we don't have full employment, we have unemployment, because we don't have easy access to capital. So you actually have structural problems in any sector where you have an opening or a liberalisation or a merger or a competition engagement where you have negative fallout much more directly tied into that sort of thing. Now, how do we handle that is the issue. And I know there are regular calls for regulators and for laws to be changed to bring, in a sense, back in a public interest test. I personally think that would be a terrible mistake for two reasons. Firstly, because competition regulators are bloody awful at the public interest. Because it's very, very difficult to do. I mean, it's an incredibly difficult thing to actually put your finger on and to do it well and to not simply fall back on either weighing the submissions or finding out who shouted loudest or who's got the best lobby or who's got the most politicians or who. It's a very, very difficult thing to actually accurately assess what the public interest is. It's the great thing with Tesco's opening in some town. I mean, we've got that in Bristol at the moment. It's like, oh my God, we don't want a Tesco's. And it's like, well, why don't you want a Tesco's? Because people might shop in it. Well, and we might lose some stores. Well, the only reason you lose stores is because people want to shop in it and they don't want to shop in the other stores. So what's the welfare argument there? I mean, there's a lot of very paternalistic issues tied up in the idea of the public interest, where basically the chattering classes know better than everyone else what they should do with their time and their money. So I think competition regulators are awful at doing that, but the problem is the political system has opted out of a large number of those issues as well. And they've either shunted them off to quasi-independent quangos or regulators who then kick it into the long grass. And so you end up with, I think, a political vacuum where the issues, particularly of local control and local access and planning and all those horrible problems, get shunted here, there and everywhere and no one takes responsibility. So I think the problem we got there is actually not an issue of competition regulation, because competition regulation is very good at what it can do, but it shouldn't try and do what it can't do. But we actually need to have, I think, a much wider debate in most actually advanced democracies about what we want, how much control we want of our local environments and where that control should be exercised. And I think the last 30 years in this country have been about sending it further and further away from the people that live in local areas. But that's a much bigger problem than I think we could ever deal with in competition regulation.
A subtle and nuanced way to end the homework for you is just to go back and think about the other meetings we've had in this series, which are about the ways in which business in different ways contributes to development through supply chain management, through its CSR, through its development of new products, and just ask yourselves the question, does competition policy help or hinder those kinds of exciting and innovative approaches? And if it does help or hinder, should it, and how could it be improved in order to do that? And the lesson I take away is minimal competition policy or competition policy adjusted to the level of development of the country can be a really powerful tool, perhaps mainly for eliminating inefficiencies, but also perhaps for doing good. And so there may be a role for Mother Teresa in the Competition Commission after all. It's been a very, very interesting session. Don't forget that on the 13th of October we may get both Douglas Alexander and Peter Mandelson. Even if we don't, we have some very good speakers. Don't forget to use the website and the blog in order to contribute your comments and cases. Don't forget to deal with this request from DFID for consultation. And please join me in thanking the speakers very much for this session.